The Philippines is an archipelago of over 7,600 islands, 115 million people, and 3 growing seasons a year. It sits at the centre of the most dynamic trade corridor on Earth. Its population is young, educated, English-speaking, and globally connected. For decades, development economists pointed at these raw ingredients and told the story of an Asian tiger waiting to happen. Every single word of that story is a government press release. What actually exists is not a development model. It is a managed extraction system built across 5 decades, designed to convert Filipino citizens into a permanent foreign exchange commodity. In 2024, Overseas Filipino Workers sent home a record $38.34 billion in remittances. That is 8.3% of the entire national economy, flowing in from workers spread across 190 countries, most of them separated from their families for years at a time. The government calls them heroes. It prints their faces on stamps. It builds dedicated terminals at airports specifically designed to process their departure. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how this system was built, who profits from it, and why the families sending money home are the very last people who benefit. Every year, the Philippine government holds a ceremony called the Bagong Bayani Awards. Bagong Bayani means new hero. It honours overseas workers who have gone above and beyond in the service of their families and their country. There are speeches, tears, and standing ovations. It is also one of the most effective pieces of political theatre in modern Southeast Asian history. The hero narrative did not emerge by accident. It was constructed deliberately and systematically as a way to mask a simple political failure. The state could not create enough jobs at home. Rather than confront that failure, successive administrations chose to rebrand it. Workers who left out of economic desperation were told they were warriors. Parents who missed their children's childhoods were told their sacrifice was patriotism. The government gave them a title and a terminal at the airport, and in doing so avoided the harder conversation entirely. The numbers confirm the sleight of hand. The Philippine labour force grew to over 50 million workers in 2023, yet underemployment remained persistently above 14%. Domestic job creation in manufacturing, infrastructure and technology has been structurally insufficient for decades. Instead of fixing that, the government deepened its investment in labour export infrastructure. It expanded its Overseas Employment Administration. It signed bilateral labour agreements with over 40 countries. It built an entire bureaucracy whose sole purpose is to move citizens out of the country. The hero is not celebrated because the hero is extraordinary. The hero is celebrated because it is cheaper to hand out a trophy than to build an economy. But here is what makes this system truly self-sustaining. The government was not just selling a story to the workers who left. It was selling a future to every child still sitting in a Philippine classroom. Walk into almost any nursing school in the Philippines today, and you will notice something unusual. The curriculum is not designed around the Philippine healthcare system. It is designed around the American one. Students prepare for the NCLEX, the US nursing licensing exam, before they have completed their first hospital rotation in Manila. In 2024, more than 28,000 Filipino nurses sat for that exam, the highest figure from any single country in the world. This is not brain drain. Brain drain implies an accidental leak. What the Philippines has is a pipeline, engineered from the classroom outward. The education system does not train citizens for domestic development. It trains them as export products. Nursing, maritime studies, engineering, IT services, domestic care work. Every major vocational track in the country has a corresponding foreign labour market waiting at the other end. The consequences inside the country are severe. Hospitals in rural provinces regularly run nurse-to-patient ratios of 1:20, and in some wards as high as 1:50. Doctors trained at Philippine institutions leave within a few years of graduating. The healthcare system is being systematically stripped of its most skilled workers, not because those workers lack loyalty, but because a first-year nurse in the United States earns 13 times what she would earn at home. The state does not try to stop this outflow. It funds it. Government scholarships, vocational training programs, and bilateral labour agreements are all oriented toward making Filipino workers more competitive in foreign markets, not in domestic ones. If this is the first time you're hearing this story laid out this way, subscribe now and make sure you're here for every chapter that follows. Because what the government does next with the billions those workers send home is where the real betrayal begins. In 2024, Filipino workers abroad sent home $38.34 billion. That figure makes headlines every year, celebrated as proof that the system is working. But look at where the money actually goes, and the celebration starts to feel hollow. The central bank surveys remittance-receiving households regularly on how they use those funds. The 2024 data showed that 96.6% of OFW households used remittances for food and household needs. The share using remittances for investment fell to just 6.2%. What remittances have built in the Philippines is not capital stock. It is a consumption economy, maintained by the forced separation of millions of families. The money flows into malls and retail chains, many of them owned by a handful of conglomerate families. It pays remittance fees to money transfer operators. It gets converted into pesos, which strengthens the currency just enough to make Philippine exports slightly less competitive, which in turn makes it harder to build the manufacturing base that would eventually reduce the need for migration in the first place. Economists have a term for a version of this dynamic. When a country earns large volumes of foreign income, it suppresses the political incentive to develop productive domestic industries. For the Philippines, the tradable product is not oil or copper, it is people. And as long as remittances keep the consumption numbers looking healthy, the pressure to actually industrialize the economy stays conveniently low for the people who would have to do something about it. Which brings us to exactly who those people are and how much they are worth. Research from the Ateneo School of Government shows that approximately 80% of the Philippine Congress belongs to political dynasties. By 2025, roughly 80% of provincial governors came from what researchers call fat dynasties, meaning families that hold multiple government positions simultaneously, while building parallel private business empires. These are not separate categories of power. They are in the same category, worn in different rooms. These families do not merely influence the economy, they own the sectors through which remittance money flows. Telecommunications, banking, real estate, retail, utilities. The major operators in each of these industries are connected through ownership chains or political alliances to a small network of elite clans. When an OFW sends money home, a significant portion of it moves through infrastructure controlled by these same families, through the bank that processes the transfer, the mall where the family shops, and the utility company that takes the monthly payment. The dynasties have also proven highly effective at blocking the reforms that would threaten their position. An anti-dynasty law has been pending in the Philippine Congress since 1987. It has never passed. Foreign investment restrictions in key sectors have been defended for decades as protections of national interest, when in practice they function as barriers shielding domestic monopolies from competition. The Philippines does not lack wealth. It lacks a system that allows that wealth to circulate beyond a few hundred families. And if the control of money and politics is not enough to keep the system running, there is one more layer beneath it. The deliberate destruction of the one sector that could have given this country genuine food sovereignty. The Philippines sits in one of the most agriculturally gifted regions on Earth. Tropical climate, multiple growing seasons, rich volcanic soil, and coastal waters that are among the most biodiverse on the planet. By every natural measure, this country should be a food exporter. Instead, in the 2024/25 marketing year, the Philippines became the world's single largest importer of rice, bringing in approximately 5.4 million metric tons of the staple crop. Its population has eaten for centuries. That number represents a collapse, not a shortage. In 2014, the Philippines produced enough rice to cover more than 90% of its own needs. By 2024, that self-sufficiency ratio had declined towards 70%, and it is still falling. Between 1991 and 2024, an estimated 520,000 hectares of rice farmland were converted to commercial and residential development. Farmgate prices for Palay crashed after tariff liberalization in 2019, benefiting import traders while squeezing smallholder farmers off their land. By February 2025, the government declared a food security emergency, acknowledging what farmers had been warning for years. A country that cannot feed itself cannot be economically independent. Every kilo of imported rice is a piso of economic leverage handed to a foreign supplier, a fiscal pressure that ultimately reinforces the argument that the country needs more remittance dollars, which means deploying more workers abroad. The import dependency and the labour export dependency are not separate problems. They are the same problem expressed in two different currencies. But none of this appears on the balance sheet the government publishes each quarter, because the balance sheet does not measure what this economy is actually costing. GDP does not count the child who grew up with a parent on the other side of the world. It does not count the marriages that collapse because two people spent their most productive years working in separate countries. It does not count the elderly grandparent who raised someone else's children because neither biological parent was home to do it. It does not count the quiet grief in communities where going abroad is not a choice but an inevitability passed from one generation to the next, like debt. Research consistently links long-term parental absence to higher rates of anxiety, depression, and academic disengagement among children in OFW households. The phenomenon is common enough to have its own local name. Filipino children with parents working overseas are called OFW kids, and the term carries a complex social weight, somewhere between admiration and quiet sorrow. The government does not fund comprehensive national studies on this. It does not build the social infrastructure that would support these fractured households. It collects the remittances, records the GDP growth, and calls the arrangement a success. The true cost of this economy is being paid in units that no central bank has ever figured out how to measure. Consumer spending stays elevated, poverty rates fall on paper, and in the official data, the system looks like it is working. What the official data cannot capture is the particular silence of a household at dinner time when one chair at the table is permanently empty. But the government does not just ignore this social devastation passively. There is an entire apparatus designed to keep the pipeline operational, and it runs with the precision of a corporation whose product is Filipino citizens themselves. The Philippine Overseas Employment Administration was created in 1982 under Ferdinand Marcos as a temporary agency to manage a temporary labour export program. It is still operating today, larger and more bureaucratically embedded than ever, with a mandate that has quietly evolved from protecting workers to efficiently processing their departure. The agency does not merely regulate migration, it markets it. Bilateral labour agreements negotiated by Philippine diplomats and labour attachés stationed across the Middle East, Asia, and Europe are not worker protection treaties. They are supply contracts. The Philippine state has signed up as a preferential labour supplier to foreign governments and foreign employers, with this agency as the operational backbone of that arrangement. The government tracks deployment numbers with the precision of a sales organisation. In 2023, more than 2.16 million Filipino workers were deployed abroad through official channels. The Department of Foreign Affairs maintains a network of consular offices whose largest recurring workload is processing documentation for citizens leaving to work for someone else's economy. What the Philippine state has built across 5 decades and multiple administrations is a vertically integrated labour export machine. It trains workers through the education system. It certifies them through licensing boards. It deploys them through the Employment Administration. It collects the foreign exchange that flows back and counts it as GDP. Every part of the government touches this pipeline. None of it is pointed at building something permanent at home. The system is not broken. That is the problem. And the same efficiency that makes it so effective is precisely what makes the next chapter so dangerous. The architects of the labour export model built it on one foundational assumption: that global demand for Filipino workers would remain stable. For 50 years, that assumption mostly held. But the conditions that made it true are now eroding simultaneously from multiple directions. Artificial intelligence and automation are systematically eliminating the categories of work that overseas Filipino workers dominate. Back-office processing, data entry, customer support, and categories of routine medical documentation are already being absorbed by AI systems at scale. The business process outsourcing sector, which employs over 1.5 million Filipinos domestically and contributes roughly 9% of GDP, faces direct structural disruption in the next 5 to 10 years. The question is not whether these jobs disappear, but how fast. Geopolitical risk compounds the exposure further. The Middle East, which accounts for a substantial share of all OFW deployments, is defined by conflict, sanctions, and political instability. A single regional escalation can strand thousands of workers overnight. Shifts in immigration policy in the United States and Canada, 2 of the top sources of remittances, can reduce inflows within a single fiscal year. The pandemic offered a preview. When global mobility stopped in 2020, remittances dipped, household savings fell, and the vulnerabilities of a consumption economy with no domestic production base became suddenly visible. The system absorbed the shock, barely. The next disruption, whether it arrives as automation, a geopolitical crisis, or an immigration crackdown, may arrive faster and hit harder than anything the model has faced before. The floor is thinner than anyone in government will admit, and there are Filipinos who already see it. Which brings us to the only question that actually matters now. The easiest response to a video like this is to feel angry, and then scroll on. The harder response, and the more important one, is to understand exactly what structural change looks like, and why it has been blocked so persistently. The Philippines does not need a miracle. It needs what South Korea, Taiwan, and Malaysia built in the second half of the 20th century. A domestic industrial base, a genuine competition policy that breaks up rent-seeking monopolies, a land and agricultural reform program with actual enforcement behind it, and a government that invests in productive domestic capacity instead of managing the departure of its citizens. None of that is exotic. All of it has been proposed, researched, and documented by Filipino economists for decades. The reason it has not happened is not ignorance, it is political economy. The families that benefit from the current arrangement sit at the centre of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The anti-dynasty law has been pending since 1987. Agricultural reform remains incomplete. Investment restrictions protect domestic monopolies while being framed as nationalist policy. The awakening that matters is not sentimental, it is analytical. It is the recognition that a government celebrating the departure of its own people is not managing development. It is managing decline and calling the workers who enable it heroes so that no one looks too closely at who is actually getting rich. The families separated by this system deserve a country worth staying in. If this video helped you see this economy differently, share it with someone who needs to understand why the Philippines has been stuck. The conversation starts with people who are willing to have it,